Welcome to the third dimension. Amid a humanitarian situation described as apocalyptic by UN officials, nearly 2 million Palestinians in Gaza face a grim fate after the United States vetoed on Friday a UN resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire. The vote came after UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres sounded the alarm on Wednesday, invoking Article 99 of the United Nations Charter. Also, UNRWA chief in Palestine, Philip Lazzarini, called for an immediate ceasefire and warned the humanitarian situation was untenable, describing his agency mandate as being on the verge of collapse. Disease, alongside the war itself, is one of the two horsemen of the apocalypse in Gaza, Martin Griffith, UN relief chief, added last week. Observers say the United States veto has left the United Nations without a clear route map to stop the conflict lasting for almost 2 months now. To discuss this topic, join me from London, Mr. Kris Gunness. Kris brings to the role more than 4-decade experience in reporting and working in the Middle East. In 2005, he joined the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and later became the spokesman for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. He is currently the director of the Myanmar Accountability Project. Kris, welcome to the program.
Thank you very, very much for having me. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you.
Okay. Now, if we could start with the only word which United Nations officials have used to describe the plight in Gaza, which is apocalypse or total destruction. That is quite frightening, Kris, isn't it?
Well, it is, particularly if you are in Gaza. And to be very clear, Hassan, this is an apocalypse of choice. Because as you quite correctly said in your introduction, America vetoed a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire. And as far as Israel is concerned, that is a green light to carry on fighting this war in the manner in which it's done so for the last 7 or so weeks, which is out without much regard for international humanitarian law. And if you look at where that international humanitarian law is embodied, for example, the Rome Statute, which set out the International Criminal Court, it's very clear. You should Google Articles 6, 7, and 8, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And they specify the kinds of actions which the belligerent parties must not take. And that, by the way, includes Hamas. It's not just the Israeli army. Such things as deliberate killing, mass displacement, using food as a weapon of war. All of those sorts of crimes and many more listed by the Rome Statute are taking place now. And as far as I'm concerned, they need to be investigated. It's very clear, not just that those crimes are being committed. Over 70% of those killed so far, 18,000 or so, are women, children, and babies. And international law is very clear that there must be a distinction between combatants and non-combatants. International law is also very clear that there must be the principle of proportionality. So you can't use a huge 2,000-pound bomb on a block of apartments just because you think there might be one Hamas operative there. There has to be clear military advantage from the attack. So all of these things stack up to the need for a clear investigation. And on the other side of international law, you have intentionality. So you have to show, for example, with the Genocide Convention, that the parties are deliberately attempting genocide. Now, Mr. Netanyahu, in the last week of October, invoked the biblical Amalek genocidal command. It's in the first book of Samuel, where God is very clear that the Israelites have to go and kill every woman, man, baby, child. No one must be left alive. Now, Netanyahu has actually said that on the record. It's clear. You've got another Israeli minister calling for a nuclear bomb to be dropped on Gaza, which does at least confirm that Israel has a nuclear bomb. The most right-wing, far-right government in the history of Israel apparently has its hands on a nuclear bomb. You had Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, saying that there should be a total blockade, no food, no water. That's a violation of the Rome Statute. So not only do you have clear evidence that these things are taking place, but you have also evidence of intentionality. Sorry, Hassan, I interrupt. Do carry on.
Okay. Now, Chris, again, in the same context of the UN chief invoking Article 99, now, if we just take this move away from the United States veto, how significant this move is in terms of the United Nations, I would say, concern, regarding the situation in Gaza?
Well, on the Richter scale of action by the by the Secretary General, it's very high up there. It's only been invoked four and a half times, depending on how you classify one of the times that Uthant did, the Secretary General Uthant. But essentially, it's basically the highest and loudest alarm bell that the Secretary General can ring. And it's a very clear signal that the world's top diplomat is extremely concerned. And he's been talking about the fears of a regional conflagration, that this should spread from Gaza. For example, Hezbollah in Lebanon has 150,000 warheads pointing south to the cities of Haifa and Tel Aviv and other parts of Israel. And that border is becoming increasingly hot, as we've seen from the number of firing incidents. Iran, what is Iran going to do? So far, both Hezbollah and Iran seem to have shown remarkable restraint, but it's not at all clear what might happen. You've got an increased American presence in the Mediterranean. You've got reports that the British government is sending military equipment to Israel. So you've got this real sense of a looming regional war, and that is extremely frightening. And I think that is one of the reasons why the Secretary General was very clear in invoking Article 99. Okay.
Now, making use of your background as UN official in Palestine, Chris, now Israel has targeted civilians and also UN facilities and even UN staff, according to the latest statistics. I think more than 133 UN staff have been killed in the airstrikes, Now, in your assessment, Chris, how do you interpret this Israeli arrogance, and not abiding by international law?
Can I say before I answer that question that Hamas also has charges to answer, because civilians must be protected universally, whether they're in southern Israel or in Gaza. And when I talk about accountability, I want to see that universally applied against Hamas and against the Israeli army. Of course, it's clear from the number of killings that perhaps the Israeli army have far more criminal charges potentially to answer. But as far as international law is concerned, and as far as protection of civilians, you mentioned the figure of 130 plus UNRWA staff have been killed. We don't know how many are under the rubble. And because the Israelis are not allowing fuel into the Gaza Strip, or very much, it's impossible to get fuel to the diggers to dig people out to find out what the real figure of UNRWA staff is. 101 UNRWA facilities have been hit, and in some cases extremely badly damaged. And of course, international law is very clear that civilian infrastructure should not be hit. You've got 280 plus people who are in UNRWA facilities being killed. You've got over 150 UNRWA facilities, which are now housing over 1 million people. So UNRWA had intended these facilities, which are mainly schools, but also warehouses and vocational training centres. UNRWA had planned, in the event of a crisis, a war like this, to have about 1,500 people in these facilities. Do the maths. There are about 100 plus of them being used. In some of them, there are over 10,000 people. There's one vocational training centre with over 25,000 people in them. So the threat to civilian life, the threat to the dignity, hundreds and hundreds of people using one toilet, women particularly without sanitary products. You've got people wearing the same clothes they were wearing shortly after the war started. You've got people without fresh water. I know a family where there are over 50 people sharing one toilet, and they have to go to the sea to get water to flush the toilet because there is no proper water. They have no water for bathing. Complete indignity. And look at the hospitals. When you see the pictures, particularly of the little children and the babies, there aren't proper hospital facilities. People can't get the medical attention they need. Imagine what it's like being disabled in Gaza right now. And there are so many children who've been orphaned. There are so many children, thousands of children, who don't have any mothers or fathers or brothers and sisters anymore. So there is a humanitarian apocalypse going on in every area of life. But as I say, it's a humanitarian apocalypse of choice, because America chose to veto that ceasefire resolution and send the green light to Israel, that it can carry on pursuing this war in the way that it has been. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a green light to more war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Okay. So we also heard the UN chief saying that he will not give up his efforts to make a ceasefire in Gaza. And as we speak, we are expecting the United Nations General Assembly to convene shortly, okay, to discuss also ceasefire decision, the one that was failed in the Security Council, okay. Do you think the UN General Assembly, okay, can succeed in what the UN Security Council failed?
Well, to be clear, General Assembly resolutions are non-binding.
Yes.
But what they do serve to do, and I think this will be the case, is to illustrate just how isolated diplomatically, politically, and on the world stage the Americans and the Israeli are. Of course, there will be small nations dependent on American economic support who may vote with Americans, they may abstain. But I think it will be very clear from the tenor of the debate, and indeed the vote, I think it will be illustrated very clearly in the General Assembly that America and the Israelis are extremely isolated. And I think it's very important that that signal is sent, because I think for people from the global south, this is the last of the colonial struggles left over from the 19th century. And I think, what we're seeing now, Palestine and Palestinians, they've become a sort of Black Lives Matter, Me Too, climate change issue. It's one of the great unresolved issues of our age. And I think if there's one thing that this conflict has illustrated, it's that the overwhelming people, particularly in the global south, feel very strongly that these horrible upturns of violence which happen in Gaza every 3 or so years, those have to end. And I think it's very clear the signals being sent, I think, to Hamas as well as to the Israelis, that this war, the Palestinian problem as seen by the Israelis, cannot be managed anymore. I think one of the mythologies that was evaporated after the 7th of October is that this Israeli myth that you could manage the conflict as opposed to resolve it. You could build walls around the Palestinians, you could blockade the Palestinians, you could arrest their children in the middle of the night, you could impose an apartheid system in the West Bank, and that somehow would guarantee the security of Israel and Israelis. And look what happened. It led to the 7th of October. So that myth that has grown up since the occupation, since 67, that's gone now. And I think on the Palestinian side, there has to be a realization that if the Palestinians are going to have their own state, a functioning economy, dignity, human development, they will get that from Israel. And I hope moving forward from this disastrous apocalyptic conflict, that there will be serious peace efforts built on the realization that the two sides are neighbors and they are mutually dependent.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Chris, as a former UN official there in Palestine, of course, you still have your connections either with some of your colleagues or perhaps families, etc. Okay. And of course, they keep telling you about the atrocities there. Can you share with us, or can you just give a sense of what is happening there in terms of the humanitarian suffering?
To be very clear, Hassan, I'm also married to an Israeli Jew. So I'm hearing things from both sides. And on the Israeli side, we know about the atrocities and we've heard about them. And the violence was utterly bestial. And, more and more of these stories are coming out. And it's very clear because the Israeli side are very good at telling their stories. And of course, these are appalling stories and the scars of these events are going to take a long time to heal. On the Palestinian side, just one example, my best friends in Gaza, they lived in Gaza City. They had a lovely home. They're sort of, middle-class family. They had an apartment in an apartment block with, 5 bedrooms, marble bathrooms, very dignified, lovely life. On the first day, they had to move down to their garage. The Israelis hit a hotel very nearby. They were suddenly covered in phosphorus dust. They went to Al-Shifa. They've got 4 children under the age of 7. They saw bodies lying everywhere. After Al-Shifa, a few hours, they realized that wouldn't offer them any sort of sanctuary or refuge. They went south to a family member in Nusayrat in the south. The night they got there, more than a dozen civilian tower blocks were hit. The brother-in-law of my friend and his eldest son went to stay with his family. The night they got there, the Israelis hit the building with a massive bomb. They all died, including my friend's brother-in-law and her nephew. They went to recover the body. Her brother went to recover the body. The morgue was overflowing. He had to look at all the faces of these dead people. And then he had to carry his nephew's body, limp body, this little child, frankly, through a war zone and present this body to his sister. I mean, that's just one tragic example, which is repeated many, many times in Gaza, sadly.
Okay. Now, you talked about the Israeli side being very good at telling their stories. But some of the stories they have told, in the end of the day, the world discovered that they were just mere lies. And all of us have heard about the children beheaded and all these stories, and the Hamas headquarters being in that Shifa hospital. All these stories were realized to be lies. How do you react to this, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I worked at the BBC for over 20 years, and I've worked in public information in the UN for 15 years. And so I'm very careful in assessing information. I think it's fair to say on the Al-Shifa story, the IDF were very foolish in putting out this video animation which showed this underground James Bond style room with a boardroom table and a flat screen television and a beautiful carpet and this, that. The world expected the IDF to produce that, and they never did. And believe you me, if they found anything like that, it would be on the front page of every newspaper around the world within an hour. And I think the fact that it isn't is extremely revealing, because I think it's clear sign that that was utter nonsense and that there wasn't this James Bond style command and control center. And they've had plenty of time in the last few weeks to find it, and they have not found it. On the crimes and the atrocities that were committed on the Israeli side, I think there has to be, and I really do think there has to be, a proper investigation. It really isn't clear that they were all lies, and it's clear that some pretty terrible things took place. So I wouldn't agree with you, blanket, these were all fictitious, they were all fabrications. I don't think that is the case. But let me say that I think that along with all the IDF alleged crimes, all those violations of the Rome Statute that established the ICC, along with all the Hamas crimes, allegedly, they must be investigated. And those who are found to have committed them must be brought to trial. And there is a principle in international law of having a fair and independent trial. Now, I'm not saying that the Israeli courts are necessarily going to be independent and going to offer a proper justice. But let's just say that in all the many years that I've been looking at, for example, settler and IDF violence in the West Bank, it's very, very clear that if you're Palestinian, you get an administrative detention order. You're not told what your crime was. You're in prison for 6 months. It can be rolled over, whatever age you are. But if you're a settler or in the IDF, no such accountability, anything like that comes your way. So I think we can draw our own conclusions on what kind of trial there might be. And I think the ICC position is very clear. If there can't be proper justice in national courts, then of course it should go to international courts such as the ICC.
Yeah, okay. So in the same context, Chris, we are talking about every side telling their own stories, okay? Perhaps when genocide took place in Rwanda, we were not having that access to digital media. Nowadays, perhaps we don't need that further investigation because things happen in broad light and civilians are being targeted in front of the world's eyes, Chris.
Yeah, so to be very clear, if you take the ICC, an ICC investigation is a very, very serious and professional thing, and they have very experienced investigators. So, for example, in Ukraine, they have people who are looking at forensic evidence that these international crimes are being committed. Now, the Palestinians, the PLO has accepted the jurisdiction of the court, and there is an open investigation which is ongoing. So I would like to think that professional ICC investigators would go through all the social media information that is there to separate the truth from the lies, and on the basis of that, make a determination about whether they can be arrest warrants and they can move to a trial. Because that's what's happened with other cases. There are arrest warrants out for Putin, for example, because there was evidence that he was committing the crime of aggression, for example, and other international crimes. And exactly the same thing must happen with Israel-Palestine. Otherwise, the court opens itself up to the accusation of being a political tool in the hands of Western powers who want to get Putin, but want to let the Israelis, for example, have complete impunity. That's not going to wash. The credibility of the ICC is at stake here. And I hope and I pray that Karim Khan, who's an excellent British KC, will do the right thing. And there's no reason to suspect he won't.
Okay. Now, a final point, if you may, Chris. In one of your previous interviews, you suggested that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict needs what we call a Mandela figure, So as a person who has delved into the dynamics of this conflict for over 4 decades, would you elaborate on this?
Well, there's a man called Marwan Barghouti, and if you talk to many Palestinians, I'm not saying that he is the next Mandela, but he's someone who I think could unite the Palestinians, because the Israelis always say there is no partner for peace. Well, if you lock up for 20 years somebody who might be a partner for peace, then of course there's no partner for peace. So I think there has to be some kind of serious discussion about who can unite the Palestinians as a partner for peace. On the Israeli side, of course, we have evidence that Mr. Netanyahu, he said he wanted to send money to Hamas in order to empower Hamas and divide the Palestinians, to obviate the chances, to make the chances go away of a two-state solution. So yes, I think it's going to take political vision on both sides. I think Netanyahu, in all likelihood, will go once this war is over. And aren't we in an interesting position? He said he wanted to destroy Hamas. And of course, it's Hamas they're negotiating with in Qatar. And given how important the freeing of the hostages will be to Netanyahu's political survival, it's interesting that Hamas basically has got his political career in their hands. Interesting, considering he said he was going to destroy them. But I think there has to be a serious consideration. Again, the dynamics of peace. I mean, I used to believe only in a one-state solution, but I've moved increasingly to the idea of a two-state solution. I think a one-state solution is problematic because Fatah would like an Arab state, Hamas would like an Islamic state, and the Israelis would like a Jewish state. So that's hugely problematic. I think a two-state solution is the only way, because I think there has to be a realization that the Palestinians will get their state once they guarantee Israel's security, and Israel will get its security once they guarantee that the Palestinians can have a state. And if there's, I think, one single lesson that could be learned from the events of 7th of October and the following events, it's that the two are joined at the hip, and peace will only be possible if there is going to be some kind of acceptance of the other side's political objectives. The Palestinians for dignity and freedom, human development, prosperity in the context of their own state, self-determination, and of the Israelis that they must have security. They do not want and cannot go yet again go through the 7th of October. I went recently on an anti-Semitism march in London, and many people were chanting, "Never again." Well, I say to everyone, never again applies universally, and never again also applies to the Palestinians as much as it applies to the Israelis and to the Jews.
Yeah. So with that remark, we come to the end of this interview, Chris. Thank you so much for your time and insights, and thank you for talking to Yemen Today TV.
It's a very great pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for having me. It's very kind.
That's all for this week. See you next time with a new edition of the third dimension.